What if I told you the male gaze didn't begin with Hollywood, cameras, or even the invention of the portrait? What if it began the moment someone with power said,
I'm
I'm
paying.
paying,
Paint
paint
her
her
like
like
this.
this? Picture an artist standing in a chilly workshop centuries ago. There's a canvas, a patron, and a woman who has absolutely no say in how her body will be represented. That's the root system of the male gaze, long before film theory gave it a name, before studios, before advertising, before algorithms. Beauty wasn't an inner ideal. It wasn't even personal. Beauty was a transaction, a performance for the person who paid the bill. Today, we're digging into the long lineage of how beauty was shaped for someone else's viewing pleasure, through art, money, myth making, and power. Let's get into it. Before film, before photography, before social media hijacked our sense of self, beauty passed through one very old filter: the desires of wealthy men with the money to commission art. And the uncomfortable truth is this: who pays decides what counts as beautiful. And for most of Western art history, the people paying were wealthy men: aristocrats, merchants, church officials, princes, men whose tastes shaped the visuals that still haunt us today. Picture a Renaissance workshop: the sharp smell of pigments being ground, the shuffle of apprentices preparing brushes, canvases stacked like dormant bodies against the walls. And at the center of it all, the patron, the man deciding how a woman will be seen for centuries. Not the woman herself. Never the woman. As Griselda Pollock writes, pre-modern art turned women into, and I quote, coded signs within male-controlled visual systems, end quote. They weren't individuals. They were symbols crafted to satisfy a narrative paid for by someone else. Women arrive in these paintings idolized, softened, stripped of personality, calibrated to a particular fantasy. Want to see what that looks like? Take Venus of Urbino, for instance. She reclines in a nobleman's private chamber, relaxed, inviting, absolutely constructed. Her gaze is confident, yes, but it's the confidence of a woman shaped by someone else's desire. Or look at Raphael's La Fornarina, where the sitter's bare breast and jewelry function less as a biography and more as erotic branding. And then Bronzino's portrait of Eleonora di Toledo with her son, where Eleonora's face is practically secondary to the opulent brocade. Her literal personhood is eclipsed by the performance of status. These aren't portraits, they're visual strategies. Let's get one thing straight. A nobleman commissioning a portrait of his wife was not memorializing her inner world. He was broadcasting a message. Her skin tone signaled lineage, her posture signaled virtue, her clothing signaled wealth, her serenity signaled how well the household was controlled. Her beauty wasn't about her, it was about him, his reputation, his alliances, his ambitions. As John Berger famously wrote, men act and women appear. But in the world of patronage, it's even more chilling. Women didn't just appear, they were arranged. And everyone who walked into the room understood the transaction immediately. Her image didn't represent her identity, it represented her husband's PR campaign. Look at how clearly this plays out. In the Arnolfini portrait, the wife stands as visual proof of the household's legitimacy, a living, notarized document. In Ginevra de' Benci, Ginevra's cool detachment is less personality and more controlled gentility, aligning her with her family's moral expectations. In Raphael's portrait of Agnolo and Maddalena Doni, Maddalena sits stiffly in her jewels, a human manifesto of obedience and wealth. These women were seen, yes, but only in the ways their husbands needed them to be. And before we continue, if some of the paintings we talk about today aren't immediately familiar, don't worry. I'll be adding the titles and artists to the show notes so you can easily look them up and see the images for yourself. Now, let's talk about the most convenient loophole in art history. Say a man wants a nude painting, not for religious inspiration, not for architectural decoration, but simply because he wants a nude woman on his wall. He can't ask the artist to paint the miller's daughter unclothed. The scandal alone could torch his reputation. So he reaches for an ancient cheat code. Make her a goddess. Call her Venus, call her Danae, call her a nymph, call her allegory of spring or love. It doesn't matter. Mythology becomes the fig leaf that covers the spectacle. Art historian T.J. Clark notes that classical themes let male patrons, and I quote, cloak erotic desire in the neutral language of culture, end quote. Translation: I'm not commissioning a nude woman, I'm commissioning history. Sure you are. Let's look at these cultural nudes. In The Birth of Venus, the goddess emerges serene and exposed, the embodiment of purity wrapped in erotic availability. In Danae, Danae lies waiting for Zeus, her body languid, receptive, golden light caressing her like a lover, a fantasy justified by a myth. And in Susanna and the Elders, a biblical tale of harassment becomes yet another excuse to present a woman nude, twisting vulnerable in her bath. In all these cases, myth vaporizes the real woman. Her name disappears, her life disappears, her interior world disappears. She becomes an eternal fantasy shaped for the viewer who paid the fee. Where does the woman go? This is the question that lingers. When beauty is commissioned, staged, corrected, mythologized, and sold, where does the actual woman vanish to? Is she behind the paint? Is she erased by it? Does she survive anywhere in the final image? Or was she never the subject to begin with? Beauty wasn't neutral. It wasn't expressive. It was a message crafted by the person holding the purse strings. And this system, this ancient algorithm, shaped everything that came after. Film theorist Laura Mulvey gave us the term the male gaze in the 1970s, but art historians had been describing the phenomenon long before the phrase existed. Because paintings didn't just portray women, they choreographed how you were supposed to look at them. Art wasn't passive, it was directional. It trained the eye. As John Berger said, and I quote, "You never look at just one thing, you look at the relationship between things and yourself," end quote. And pre-modern art made damn sure that relationship placed the viewer above the woman pictured. Let's look at the posture problem. Reclining, tilted head, downcast eyes, soft limbs, slight parting of the lips. These weren't natural, they were instructions. They were stage directions written on the female body itself. Visual cues telling the viewer, I'm passive, I'm available to your gaze, I exist for your pleasure. Art historian Whitney Chadwick notes that these poses created a vocabulary of submission that was so consistent it became invisible. The visual equivalent of background noise. You didn't notice the choreography because you'd seen it since childhood. Let's look at some of those choreographed poses. In Titan's Venus of Urbino, the raised arm, the soft belly, the inviting gaze. None of that is spontaneous. It's a curated, erotic pose. In Ingres's Grand Odalisque, the exaggerated spine twist is physically impossible. A body reshaped to please the eye, not to represent reality. In Goya's La Maja Desnuda, the parted lips and relaxed limbs perform availability. These poses weren't portraits of women, they were portraits of fantasy. And here's the twist. The more powerful the man commissioning the painting, the more soft, idealized, and pliant the woman in his artworks became. Power didn't just buy the painting, power sculpted the body inside it. Over centuries, these images taught generations how to read the female body. They created a visual grammar of youth as purity, pale skin as virtue and class, nudity as natural femininity, but only if she looked modest while naked. The eroticized passivity of the ideal woman. This grammar became instinct, and by instinct, I don't mean humans were magically born craving pale, pliant, well-behaved women. Please. I mean centuries of visual brainwashing so steady and subtle that people started calling it taste instead of what it really was, training. You didn't need to study art to understand it. The paintings taught you, quietly, relentlessly. Art historian Linda Nochlin describes this as disciplinary aesthetics, images gently training viewers to associate female worth with softness, stillness, and sexual availability. This wasn't about women being admired. It was about women being legible to the people who mattered in the social hierarchy, the male patrons, clergy, scholars, and elites who shaped taste. Every brushstroke was a reminder: this is what a proper woman looks like. This is how you should view her. This is how she exists in relation to you. And to reinforce this script, painters repeated the same motifs across centuries. Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring turns her head with a soft vulnerability designed to captivate the viewer. Rubens' Three Graces cluster together in an arrangement that displays them rather than represents them. Boucher's endless mythological nudes show women as decorative flesh draped in erotic softness. These works taught viewers how to desire, and they taught women how to perform desirability. Women looking back was rare for a reason. On the rare occasion when a woman in art did meet the viewer's eyes, scholars note the immediate shift. She becomes powerful, disruptive, fully human. A direct gaze unsettles the entire hierarchy. In portraits where women look back, really look back, the dynamic flips. She's no longer passive. She's no longer arranged. She's no longer a symbol. She becomes a subject, a person with thoughts, feelings, and a life of her own. Art historian Mary Garrard writes that a woman's direct gaze, and I quote, interferes with her function as spectacle, end quote. It interrupts the pleasure of the viewer. It demands recognition rather than consumption. And that was not the point of most commissions. So most didn't look back. Portraiture repeatedly cast the woman as aware of being seen, but not bold enough to return the look. Her gaze was lowered, softened, turned away, or directed to some invisible point off canvas, anywhere but into the viewer's eyes. Because a woman looking back is a woman claiming equal footing. A woman looking back is a woman asserting subjecthood. A woman looking back collapses the fantasy. So, artists avoided it, patrons discouraged it, and viewers got used to a world where women existed to be seen, not to see. Here's where it gets interesting. When women entered the profession, often fighting bitterly for access to training and workshops, the entire visual language began to shift. And this wasn't a small aesthetic tweak, it was a tectonic movement. Women entering the art world were not simply joining it, they were trespassing into a system designed specifically to exclude them. A system that had been crafting female images without women for centuries. Art historian Linda Nochlin famously wrote that, and I quote, "The question is not why there have been no great women artists, but why the conditions of greatness were structured against them," end quote. Women weren't kept out because they lacked talent. They were kept out because the entire institution relied on female absence to maintain the male gaze's monopoly. Yet some women pushed through anyway. A female painter depicting herself wasn't just making art. She was asserting authorship of her own image, something most women never had. Self-portraiture became the one place a woman could look back. You get gaze without subservience, bodies without erotic cues, authority, not objecthood. And that difference rattled the established powers. Let's take a look at some groundbreaking self-portraits. In Self-Portrait as the Allegory of Painting, Gentileschi paints herself as painting itself. Muscular, focused, mid-action, utterly uninterested in the viewer's desire. In Self-Portrait with her daughter Julie, the intimacy is maternal, not erotic. Her touch, her expression, her affection all defy the languid beauty tropes male artists imposed on women. In Self-Portrait, Leicester beams confidently at the viewer while painting, literally caught in the act of creation, not posing as a muse. These images weren't decorative, they were confrontational. They said, "I make the image, I define myself, I am not a surface for your fantasies." And this was revolutionary. Because a woman who represents herself is a woman who refuses to be represented by someone else. When women artists painted other women, the tone changed again. Bodies became embodied instead of symbolic, active instead of passive, social beings instead of decorative surfaces. The shift is immediate and unmistakable. The body is not arranged. The face is not softened into erotic invitation. The posture is not engineered for a male viewer. Instead, the sitter exists within her own interior world, thinking, interacting, inhabiting her life. For example, in the child's bath, the female body is not eroticized, it's functional, intimate, absorbed in caregiving. In Woman at Her Toilette, beauty appears as ritual and self tending, not spectacle. The viewer is invited, not privileged. In The Chess Game, women are absorbed in thought, strategy, and play, intellectual presence replacing erotic performance. Beauty wasn't something performed for an external viewer, it became relational, interior, grounded in lived experience. Art historian Griselda Pollock describes this shift as, and I quote, women reclaiming the subjectivity stolen from them, end quote. Women artists didn't simply paint bodies, they painted selves. These works dismantle the choreography of passivity piece by piece. Hands move with purpose, faces carry thought, bodies exist in the gravity of their own worlds. This didn't erase the male gaze, but it cracked the monopoly. It created alternate ways of seeing, small portals through which women could exist as subjects rather than surfaces. And once that crack appeared, it spread, slowly, quietly, persistently. Women painting women introduced a visual language that male patrons had never commissioned. Women as thinkers, workers, mothers, friends, creators, dreamers. Not muses, not objects, not allegories, not fantasies, just women finally visible to themselves. Even if the artists or sitters had different intentions, museums later shaped the narrative. Curators decided what gets displayed, how it's lit, what story it tells, whose bodies become canonical. And museums historically prioritized works commissioned by powerful men, which meant the visual legacy of beauty was curated almost entirely through that lens. Museums weren't neutral containers, they were, and still are, cultural editors. Art historian Carol Duncan argues that museums act as ritual spaces that teach visitors how to behave, what to value, and whom to revere. When you walk through those echoing corridors, you're not just looking at art, you're absorbing a worldview that's been meticulously arranged for you. And for centuries, that worldview reinforced the male gaze, not just in what was shown, but also in what was omitted. Linda Nochlin notes that the absence of women artists in museum collections doesn't reflect a lack of skill or impact. It reflects the institutional structures that privileged male creators, male patrons, and male narratives. This absence didn't just distort art history, it shaped public understanding of what genius and beauty were supposed to look like. Museums weren't reflecting culture, they were manufacturing it. We still see the ripple effects today. The poses are familiar, the expressions are familiar, the ideal proportions are familiar, the scripts are familiar. We recognize them even if we've never set foot in a gallery, because the museum canon seeped into textbooks, into advertising, into photography, into fashion, into Hollywood, into every visual language that came after. Cultural theorist Ariela Aisha Azoulay writes that institutions, and I quote, make certain ways of seeing appear natural, end quote. What begins as a curatorial choice becomes an aesthetic expectation, and what becomes an aesthetic expectation becomes a social standard. So when we talk about the male gaze in film, advertising, or social media, we're not describing a modern invention. We're describing a very old operating system that got upgraded across centuries. The algorithms of Instagram didn't appear out of nowhere. The sexual framing in movies didn't spring from thin air. The influencer poses we recognize instantly have visual ancestors. As John Tagg puts it, visual culture accumulates like sediment, layer upon layer, until the oldest conventions feel contemporary simply because they've never been interrupted. Museums gave older gazes permanence. They enshrined them, preserved them, exhibited them, recirculated them, and in doing so, they extended the lifespan of the male gaze far beyond the studio or the salon. Even now, when museums attempt to diversify, revise, or correct their collections, they're working against centuries of visual conditioning. As Griselda Pollock reminds us, institutions don't simply show art, they produce cultural memory. and cultural memory is stubborn. So when a woman today posts a selfie and instinctively angles her body a certain way, when a film lights its female characters with soft eye fusion and warm hues, when advertising leans into a familiar posture or expression, they are tapping into visual codes that were standardized long before photography, long before Hollywood, long before TikTok. We're not inventing the gaze, we're inheriting it. Beauty didn't just sit there passively in a frame. It was engineered, directed, weaponized. It lived inside a power structure. The male gaze didn't start with directors or photographers. It started with patrons, church officials, aristocrats, people who controlled resources, images, and narratives. They weren't just shaping what beauty looked like, they were shaping who beauty was for. Beauty wasn't an internal compass. It wasn't democratic, it wasn't expressive. It was a cultural script written by people who had the money and power to commission the images that lasted. And as Bell Hooks reminds us, and I quote, "The gaze has always been political," end quote. Who is allowed to look, who is forced to be looked at, who gets to define the frame. These are social hierarchies masquerading as aesthetics. For centuries, the museum walls, the royal courts, the wealthy households all echoed the same message. This is beauty. This is womanhood. This is how you are supposed to see and be seen. The ripple effects didn't fade. They calcified. They embedded themselves in film language, in fashion photography, in ad campaigns, in social media filters, in all the places we think we're expressing ourselves freely. Sociologist Eva Illouz writes that modern self-presentation is always in dialogue with inherited aesthetics. We think we're choosing our angles, our poses, our expressions, but we're often choosing from a script we didn't write. So the real question isn't whether the male gaze still exists. Of course it does. It just travels now, it updates, it downloads new shapes. The question is, what would beauty look like if women had always been the ones deciding how they were seen? What styles would have emerged? What bodies would have been celebrated? What faces would have become iconic? What postures would have become the default? What parts of ourselves might feel less strange, less shameful, less other? And then, who might we become if we start rewriting the scripts now? If women claim authorship, full authorship, not just in art studios, but in media, film, photography, fashion, digital spaces. If the historical weight of being seen gives way to the possibility of seeing ourselves differently. What happens when the frame finally shifts? Not just who stands inside it, but who holds it. That's the afterlife of the gaze we should be talking about. Not the version we inherited, but the version we could create. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the male gaze, a system that started long before film, long before photography, and apparently has been living rent-free in visual culture for centuries. And when you step back and look at it, it's kind of wild how many of these poses, expressions, and beauty rules we still recognize today started centuries before cameras even existed. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that from now on it makes you look at paintings, movie scenes, or even your own camera roll a little differently. If it did, make sure to share it. Send it to your friends, your coworkers, your group chat. Honestly, send it to your enemies too. And if you want to help the show grow, head on over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review the show. It really does help more people find the podcast and become part of the Beauty Unlocked family. Until next time, my love buckets, be safe out there. Take care of yourselves and of each other. And remember to stay curious always. You'll hear from me again next week. Bye.
Make it clap, 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 clap. Make it clap, 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 clap. Make it clap, clap, clap. Make it clap, clap. Make it clap.